My name is McManus, and I'm a design scientist. And when I was a kid, I just loved taking things apart. And I stumbled into this idea that artists are about their own agenda. They're not supposed to be for the man. They're supposed to be for themselves and their reaction to the world, and then exploring that reaction to the world. But designers have to sort of subvert their ego, and they have to take on the needs of other people. They have to talk to the need knowers. And I kind of fell in love with the idea of being a designer. So I became a product designer, industrial designer. And in that process, I joined this lab called Maya that came out of Carnegie Mellon back 35 years ago. And it was this interdisciplinary lab of architects and engineers and product designers and anthropologists and cognitive psychologists and filmmakers. And it was this wild thing. And we were focused on one thing: how we might tame complexity and extend human reach, how we could effectively help people have prosthetics to do things they normally couldn't do, to reach further, to see further, to do more things. And in that process, we ended up spinning out 5 or 6 different companies. And so each one of them was trying to tame complexity. One of them was for complex decision making, and that became a hundreds of million dollar organization. Another one was about teaching other people how to put people first and be human-centered and build a human-centered design institute. And we taught over 100,000 people around the world, and it was adopted by the Obama administration, and it was taught for citizen-centered design. Another one was around data fusion and how do you fuse all sorts of data so that you could see new insights. Another one was about building modular computational devices so that we could have software or hardware-defined assemblable things from lampshades to entire stadiums in what you today would call the IoT, but make it democratic, make it more so more people could reach it. And so in that whole process, I was making a lot of things. I built a lot of consumer products. I built a lot of vehicles, and I built a lot of systems. And in that system thinking, you end up always referring back to nature, because nature is like the most glorious system we've ever seen. And it has all these secret hidden patterns. Atoms make molecules, make cells, make organs, make systems. Each one is stable. Those systems make you and me. We make us, and we make communities. Like that layered semantics is a design pattern. And I thought, wow, how could we apply those design patterns to products and to vehicles and to places and create a more thriving world? Here's the problem. It turns out that all that stuff that we made is turning into oceans and islands of waste floating in the ocean, and also microplastics in our bodies and our poop and our brain. And so all these second order effects have come out because we've done such a good job with the Industrial Revolution. And so now the question is, how could we take the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, 250 years of R&D, and the wonders of nature's revolution, 4 billion years of R&D, and how do we actually have sort of creative polymaths and interdisciplinary jazz and play to usher in a new living material age where we can get away from forever plastics and forever chemicals and move towards a living material age, frankly. I was pretty naive. Obviously, as a designer, and designers and architects like myself, we're always interested in the materiality of things. The material teaches us things. If we take a piece of wood and we push it on a bandsaw with the grain, it chatters all over the place. If we push it 90 degrees to the grain, it's like really smooth. And so the material is your teacher, and you're always prototyping and making things. And so you're always trying to get a sense of it. But a lot of what we've done is focus on assembly and not disassembly, not deconstruction, just reconstruction. Of course, there's stuff like the cradle-to-cradle movement and thinking about design for disassembly and things like that. But it's really, we don't at the beginning of something think about how it could have a second, a third, a fourth life. We really focus on just making that thing. And I joined Autodesk, the office of the CTO. I took a sabbatical from being a CEO. I shifted to chairman at this startup studio called Maya. And we sold that to Boston Consulting Group. Now it's about 3,000 people in 80 offices, and they're all the builders. So I'm excited about them doing that. I shifted over to Autodesk, and at the time we were exploring generative design. And the notion was, could you not design the product? Could you design the goals, the constraints, the variables, the materiality? How does it get manufactured? What's the price cost? How much embodied carbon is in there? Could you design the kind of negative space and then spawn thousands of AI agents to explore that space? It kind of like spawning thousands of extra design interns or architectural interns and have them all come back. And a lot of the stuff was garbage. You'd be like, that's not so much. Every once in a while, you'd discover this sweet space of possibility. And then you'd say, well, what about this? If it was a building, you'd say, what do you think? You're the CFO for the building. You're the landlord. And they'd say, oh, I don't care about that goal. Let me relax it. And it would generate thousands more. And this is kind of the way species evolve out in the wild based on what we would think of as form follows forces. And so we started looking at generative design as this new approach to this. And then I attended this synthetic biology conference called SynBioBeta. It was kind of mind-blowing. And I was invited to take a class at MIT called How to Grow Almost Anything. And it was modeled on the idea of how to make almost anything, which is a classic class in prototyping. But it was how to grow it. And it turns out that biology has this crazy amount of complexity and wonder at every level. Every cell in your body has a spare copy of you in the form of DNA. So nature chose wild redundancy. And there's a lot of basal intelligence built into everything, not even in the brain. It's just the cells shape us by each other. And so whether it's cells or cephalopods or crews of people, there's this embodied, collective, and connected and emergent intelligence. And so I fell in love with that. And my final project was called the SpiderBot. And the idea was, let's do a desktop printer, kind of like the MakerBot, but I could set goals, constraints for structural proteins like silk and lignin and chitosan from shrimp shells and other things. And we could say, okay, I've got waste material from here, I've got this, and it would dynamically come up with a mixture that we could print and I could test, and I could have a test sample as an architect or as a designer to try things. And David Kong and George Church, who were leading that class, said, we had this guy from the Silk Lab. And he's the glorious, the best silk engineer on the planet, bioengineer. His name is Theo at Tufts. Why don't you go visit him? And he might be able to supply you with powder to try building the SpiderBot. And I called Theo, and he pulls up this giant bucket, and he's we've been able to reconstitute fibrin, which is this crazy amphiphile. It's got just sort of a polymathic material. It can be hydrophobic and be hydrophilic. It attracts things. It's kind of a foundational material in structural proteins. And it was evolved by moths on mulberry trees. It was also evolved by clams in the deep ocean. And so it's been evolved by many different creatures to solve all sorts of problems. And so he said, do that. And then he also said, come to this conference. It's around planet action and learn more about it. And I went last year and saw that, and I fell in love. And I thought, whoa, how can I combine what I've learned about system thinking and complexity and product and architecture, and also generative design and AI and the possibilities, and how might I merge that with what's happening with living materials? And that's really what brought me here. And now we're building a global living material movement and a startup studio, a VC studio, to basically get more of this innovation out in the world, as well as educational tools, so that there's a whole nother generation of kids like you and me and others that fall in love with the wonders and the dynamic variability of nature. So silk is fibrin, that's the name of the protein. And it's one of 300 million proteins on planet Earth. So life has been very busy. And just this one, it's water soluble, it's completely biocompatible. People have been using it for stitches and actually wound care for thousands of years. There's something called the Silk Road that actually kind of built commerce around the world. People were planting mulberry trees and growing different things, and they've discovered all sorts of variations, like the clams in the ocean that actually create these golden beards. And only wealthy people could have these woven beautiful things out of this golden silk. But that one material, if you put that combined with wood waste, you can make particle board, and you can make IKEA furniture, but without formaldehyde. Formaldehyde's pretty toxic. And so even in the act of us cutting apart old furniture, we expose ourselves and others to things. What if you could just have it with silk and waste? Or if you take silk and chitosan, which comes from waste from shrimp shells, we create tons of waste. If I take those two things and some cellulose from wood waste, I can make leather and I can 3D print it. And it's entirely reversible. So that's the interesting question, is how might we take the lowest energy. Silk happens to have a very low energy to do this. You can use some safe salts and water and agitation and heat, and you can make it into a powder or a liquid. And then how might we use that to create entirely new things that are reversible? Now, one of the things I've just gotten very excited about is at Autodesk, we were putting IoT sensors all over these vehicles and all over these things, and we were sensing 4 billion data points every afternoon and seeing if we could evolve the car through generative design with lots of data. It turns out one of the entrepreneurs at the lab that we're working on is from Turkey, and she is interested in women's health. And she's working with the Baker Lab, who just won a Nobel for AI and basically folding proteins, to actually develop de novo proteins that are bonded with silk and solid state 3D printed, or actually 2D printed with a normal Canon printer, to actually create chromic sensors that change color depending on what's happening. So if you had a bra and you were emitting some of the proteins that actually lead to cancer, it would change color. And if you were dealing with other kinds of things with your sweat, we would actually be able to detect at mass all this stuff. So one aspect of this is data, and how life works is it's constantly putting out these little signals that we're immune to. We don't hear it. The other part of it is, how do we close the loop? Once we have that data, how do we actually start moving towards getting rid of these forever chemicals, understanding ourselves, understanding the world, and focusing just as much on deconstruction as reconstruction? I started as a product designer, and then I stepped back and learned about how to be a design scientist and a systems scientist, and then I had stumbled into people that were cognitive psychologists, and they thought truth was over there. And then I'd talk to engineers or business people, and they'd say, no, truth is over there. And this idea that disciplines, the thing you belong to, you define yourself a filmmaker, a journalist, et cetera, that's totally artificial. That was this artificial slicing of the universe so that we could teach people in like a 15th century educational system. And what I see at these conferences, at these gatherings, is that we're actually smashing together people in a sort of antidisciplinary way. We're saying, actually, all of us have value. That truth that you think is the most important truth if you're a computer scientist, turns out there's truth over this way too, and they've spent just as much time exploring it. And so what I love about this kind of a space is it's a concentrator. It's a concentrator of people and ideas, and it also creates these loose connections between very different and disparate communities. And I think we need to do more of that. We need more polymaths that are curious but also humble, and that actually understand that, like, yeah, you climb that mountain of a particular discipline, but once you got there, you might have seen a very big mountain over there. You're going to have to climb down from biology and learn about computation, or you might have to go through the wilderness and learn about something else. And so these gatherings have to happen, but then we also have to take action afterwards. There is a huge opportunity for massive value, huge industries. I'm seeing billion-dollar industries have an opportunity here, and we need value, and we need that entrepreneurial spirit, and we need to unlock it. But we can't just drop in, replace something for Teflon that's had over 100 years of evolution and investment and subsidized funding from the oil industry, say. What we need to look at the entire value chain and think of new and unlike new magic properties that just can't be done with normal engineered material. And that's why we have to tap into this intellectual property from 4 billion years of Mother Nature. So I think at the end, it's kind of Moore meets Metcalfe meets Mother Nature. And I think they all have to come together.